Berlin, August 13, 1961. The city awoke to the soft rattle of trucks, to the scrape of shovels, to the strange silence of soldiers unrolling barbed wire across familiar streets. It was a Sunday morning, yet the air carried the unease of something permanent. Overnight, the capital of a divided Germany had been split by force, not by law or by vote, but by coils of steel, concrete blocks, and armed men who had their orders. Families peered from apartment windows and could not believe what they were seeing. Lovers who had said goodnight across district lines just hours before found themselves separated. A nurse who had finished her night shift on the western side of the city discovered she could no longer return home to the east. A father who had worked late in West Berlin never saw his children wake in East Berlin that morning. The city was sealed, and so were its lives. The Berlin Wall was not announced in speeches. It was executed as an operation, swift and deliberate, shaped by decisions made months earlier in Moscow and East Berlin. Nikita Khrushchev had grown impatient with the flow of East Germans fleeing westward, while Walter Ulbricht, head of the German Democratic Republic, insisted that the socialist state could not survive unless the escape route was cut. Yet it was not Khrushchev nor Ulbricht who would guard this wall most fiercely. The duty fell to the Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi, led by Erich Mielke. For Mielke, a man who had risen through the ranks with the reputation of a loyal communist and ruthless enforcer, the wall was not simply a border, it was an instrument of control that had to be reinforced not only with concrete, but with invisible chains. The early hours of construction revealed the human dimension of division. People gathered at the barbed wire, pleading with soldiers, pointing at houses just meters away, crying across the fence. Soldiers did not answer. They had orders to watch, to remain silent, to hold their rifles firmly, and make clear with their presence that the era of free crossings was over. Western reporters arrived quickly, their cameras catching images of elderly women shouting at soldiers, of children looking confused, of workers stranded on the wrong side of town. These photographs became international symbols, but inside East Berlin, another set of images was being captured, not by cameras for newspapers, but by the notes of Stasi officers, who shouted, who resisted, who tried to cross, who displayed anger. Every gesture, every word became a file entry. The Stasi had existed since 1950, modeled on Soviet security services. Its headquarters in Lichtenberg grew into a city within a city, with miles of corridors, interrogation rooms, and offices dedicated to surveillance. By 1961, it already commanded thousands of officers, but with the wall rising, its mandate expanded. Stopping escape was only one objective. The deeper mission was to ensure that no citizen doubted the legitimacy of the state, and if they did, that doubt would remain private, suffocated by fear of exposure. Erich Mielke embodied this vision. A veteran of communist movements, hardened by war and ideological battles, he believed that the state could only endure by knowing everything. Under his leadership, the Stasi perfected an obsession with data. If a worker complained at a factory, if a student drew a cartoon mocking the regime, if a priest preached too passionately about freedom, the Stasi wanted to know. Information was not just gathered, it was catalogued with precision. Every report, every intercepted letter, every telephone tap was stored. By the end of the regime, these records would stretch more than 100 kilometers in length, if placed side by side. The wall therefore became both a physical and psychological barrier. Soldiers patrolled its length, dogs ran in the sandy death strip, searchlights illuminated the night. Yet the greater power lay in the invisible presence of the Stasi in every neighborhood. Within months of the wall's construction, East Germans understood that escape was nearly impossible, but even more terrifying was the realization that trust itself had been eroded. A neighbor might be an informant, a colleague might be reporting conversations, even a spouse might be coerced into collaboration. The Stasi had turned the nation into both prison and guard. To grasp the scale, one must consider the numbers. By the 1980s, East Germany had a population of 16 million. The Stasi employed 90,000 full-time officers, an extraordinary figure for a state of that size. Beyond them stood nearly 200,000 unofficial collaborators, the inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, ordinary citizens enlisted to report. That is one in every 50 East Germans feeding information into the system. The reach was unprecedented. No other state in modern Europe achieved such saturation, and it was not just the quantity of surveillance, but its thoroughness. Every letter that crossed the border was opened in secret rooms, steamed, read, resealed. Every telephone line could be tapped, every workplace seeded with informants. The files reveal chilling detail. In one case, a university student suspected of Western sympathies was followed for weeks. His conversations noted, his friendships mapped, his attendance at lectures recorded. Eventually, he was denounced by a fellow student, recruited quietly as an informant. The young man's career ended before it began. In another case, a pastor delivering sermons that emphasized individual freedom found his parish infiltrated. Parishioners reported on his words. The congregation split into those loyal to the state and those who remained faithful to him. He was eventually arrested, his church placed under permanent observation. These stories are not isolated. They represent the daily machinery of surveillance that defined East German life behind the wall. The wall itself evolved, at first only barbed wire and guards. Within a few years, it hardened into concrete, reinforced by watchtowers and fortified checkpoints. The most infamous of these was Checkpoint Charlie, where East met West under the gaze of both American and Soviet soldiers. But beyond the border crossings, the real checkpoint was internal, a barrier in the mind of every citizen who weighed every word before speaking. The Stasi ensured that self-censorship became as strong as any wall of concrete. This was the environment in which the surveillance empire took root, growing quietly, systematically, relentlessly. It was an empire built not on conquest abroad, but on control within. An empire whose strength was measured in whispers rather than battles, and it would last until the late 1980s, when the very weight of information and fear could no longer hold back the tide of change. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? The machinery of the Stasi was not limited to officers in uniform or men in long coats lingering at street corners. It was a vast system of tradecraft that reached into the smallest crevices of daily life, designed to render private space obsolete. Every apartment could be penetrated, every workplace compromised, every letter and conversation documented. The strength of the Ministry for State Security lay not only in its numbers, but in its ingenuity, in the obsessive way it refined the art of listening and recording until silence itself seemed unsafe. The recruitment of informants was its most effective tool. They were called unofficial collaborators, and the ranks swelled until the very concept of trust began to dissolve. A friend might be loyal one day and coerced the next. Some were recruited through ideology, convinced they were defending socialism against subversion. Others were pressured with threats, their careers or families placed at risk unless they agreed to report. Still others collaborated in exchange for favors, a promotion, the chance to travel abroad. The methods varied, but the outcome was constant. The Stasi achieved a saturation of human surveillance unmatched in modern history. Records show that informants were trained in subtlety. They were instructed to ask innocent questions, to observe body language, to recall small details: who arrived at a meeting, what books were on a shelf, which neighbors appeared to own Western goods. Reports were written with bureaucratic precision, filed, catalogued, and cross-referenced. The result was an ocean of paper, each drop a fragment of a life observed. By 1989, the agency had created files on nearly 6 million individuals, more than a third of the entire population of East Germany. The technical side of surveillance was equally extensive. Letters were intercepted in secret postal control centers where machines could steam envelopes open without leaving visible marks. Stamps were softened, seals lifted, and after being read and photographed, the letters were carefully resealed and returned to the system. Thousands of pieces of mail were processed daily, and almost no one suspected the scale of intrusion. For those who did, the knowledge was paralyzing. One never knew which letter might be read, which word might be misinterpreted, which casual phrase might be preserved forever in a file. Telephones, too, were never secure. The Stasi had the ability to monitor tens of thousands of lines simultaneously. Switchboards were fitted with taps that allowed officers to listen in real time or record for later analysis. Technicians perfected ways of disguising interference so that the caller would never hear the faint clicks or echoes that betrayed a tap. The transcripts reveal ordinary conversations marked for suspicion, complaints about shortages, jokes about leaders, even gossip about neighbors. What mattered was not the gravity of the words, but the fact that they revealed an attitude, a potential seed of dissent. Apartments were entered without warrants or warning. Teams known as Zersetzung units practiced psychological operations designed not simply to arrest dissidents, but to erode their stability, to make life intolerable until resistance collapsed. Microphones were hidden behind wallpaper, inside power sockets, even within furniture. Cameras were installed in hallways. Substances were introduced to create paranoia, the rearranging of furniture while an occupant was away, the unexplained loss of a personal item, the subtle sabotage of professional work. These acts left no visible scars, but produced a climate of fear so pervasive that many victims began to doubt their own sanity. The files tell chilling stories. One journalist suspected of anti-state activity found his typewriter tampered with so that letters misaligned, making his work appear sloppy and unprofessional. His reputation declined, his confidence faltered, and eventually he abandoned his efforts. Another man who had tried to organize small discussion groups about reform found that his car keys disappeared regularly, that neighbors accused him of things he had not done, that his applications for jobs were mysteriously rejected. He became isolated, depressed, and finally silent. The Stasi did not need to imprison every critic. It could neutralize them by dismantling their lives piece by piece. The reach extended into culture and science. Artists were watched, their exhibitions scrutinized for signs of Western influence. Musicians were monitored for the lyrics they chose. Even scientists working in universities were observed, particularly those with contacts abroad. Travel permits became both carrot and stick. To be allowed to visit a conference in the West required loyalty, but once there, one might be approached to serve as an informant in return. Those who refused found themselves denied future opportunities. Those who accepted became entangled in a web of obligations they could never escape. At times the surveillance revealed, not dissent, but the resilience of human spirit. People continued to gather, quietly, to discuss forbidden books, or listened to Western radio. Families celebrated with smuggled goods, hiding the evidence afterward. Young people tuned antennas carefully to catch foreign broadcasts, whispering along to music that carried a taste of freedom. The Stasi noted these acts and filled their files, but could not fully extinguish them. Even under watch, life found ways to resist. Still, the scale of surveillance made escape from its gaze nearly impossible. In factories, workers reported on each other's attitudes. In schools, teachers identified students who seemed restless. In churches, priests were shadowed, their sermons dissected line by line. The surveillance state became a mirror in which every citizen saw themselves reflected back as both observer and observed. To walk the streets of East Berlin was to inhabit this dual reality. You could glance at a neighbor and wonder if they were listening more closely than they should. You could lower your voice in a cafe, aware that the waiter might not be neutral. You could write a letter knowing it might not be private. The effect was cumulative, corrosive, subtle. It was not always the fear of prison that silenced people, but the knowledge that they were never alone, that even in solitude the state might be watching. By the 1970s, the Stasi had refined these practices into a doctrine of total security. It was not simply about collecting information, but about shaping society so that dissent never took root. The mere suspicion of surveillance was often enough to suppress action. Citizens internalized the presence of the state, censoring themselves before a file ever needed to be opened. This was the triumph of the Stasi's tradecraft, a victory not measured in arrests, but in silence. And yet, within this silence, cracks always remained. Some informants resented their role and gave false reports. Some citizens found ways to mislead the state, creating decoys, spreading harmless rumors to distract attention from more serious acts of defiance. The system was vast, but it was not flawless. Still, its weight pressed down on every life, shaping choices, limiting imagination, and ensuring that the wall's concrete barrier was reinforced by walls of the mind. The empire of surveillance was not visible on maps, but it was there in the nervous glance of a passerby, in the pause before speaking, in the deliberate avoidance of subjects too dangerous to discuss. It was there in the thousands of files written each day, in the miles of shelves filling with the details of ordinary lives. And it was there in the unspoken understanding that in East Germany, to think freely was itself a risk. The Berlin Wall was not only a barrier to freedom, it was a battlefield of ingenuity. On one side stood citizens desperate to escape, on the other an apparatus determined to stop them. The Stasi became the gatekeeper of this silent war, a war fought not with tanks and artillery, but with shovels, forged documents, false identities, and betrayal. In the first years after 1961, escape attempts were frequent, sometimes reckless. Families tried to climb the wire before concrete blocks replaced it. Workers attempted to ram vehicles through makeshift checkpoints. Some leapt from apartment windows that faced the western sector, using sheets as ropes, mattresses as landing pads. Many succeeded in those chaotic months, but once the wall hardened, escape required planning, secrecy, and technical skill. The most daring attempts came through the earth. Between 1961 and 1965 alone, at least 70 tunnels were begun under Berlin. Some were short and shallow, intended to reach a nearby cellar or sewer. Others were ambitious engineering projects, stretching hundreds of meters, supported with wood and equipped with ventilation. The most famous of these became known as Tunnel 57, an escape route that in October 1964 allowed 57 East Berliners to crawl to freedom in the West. It was built by a group of students who worked night after night, carrying out soil in buckets, hiding the evidence, risking discovery at every stage. But the Stasi was not idle. It created units specialized in detecting tunnels, equipped with seismic sensors that could pick up faint vibrations underground. Informants were deployed to construction sites, to neighborhoods where unusual noise or movement might indicate digging. Tunnel 57 itself was nearly betrayed by a collaborator, yet by the time the Stasi learned enough to act, dozens had already escaped. Other tunnels were less fortunate. In several cases, the Stasi penetrated the network early, allowing some escapes to occur while planning mass arrests later. Files reveal that the ministry sometimes let tunnels remain open deliberately, using them to identify wider circles of dissent before closing the trap. Operations extended beyond tunnels. Escape by air balloon, by homemade aircraft, even by zipline was attempted. One of the most striking cases occurred in 1979, when two families constructed a hot air balloon from scraps of fabric and gas canisters. They floated across the border at night, landing in Bavaria. The Stasi's files afterward documented the embarrassment of officials and the furious analysis of how such a large object could have been assembled undetected. For every success there were countless failures. Guards fired without hesitation, and many East Germans were killed in the attempt. Their names became symbols in the West, remembered as martyrs, but in the East their stories were often buried in silence. Counter-operations were relentless. Forged documents were examined by specialists who could detect the smallest irregularity in paper or ink. Border guards were rotated constantly to prevent familiarity. Even when escapees succeeded, the Stasi worked to punish those left behind. Families of defectors lost jobs, lost apartments, lost education opportunities. The message was clear. Flight carried a cost, not only for the individual, but for everyone connected to them. The Stasi also played an international game. Western intelligence agencies often supported escape operations, sometimes as propaganda coups. The CIA and MI6 financed or facilitated several tunnels, including the Berlin Tunnel in the mid-1950s, an earlier project to tap Soviet communication lines. Though George Blake, a British mole, betrayed the tunnel to Moscow before it became fully operational, the idea lived on in smaller civilian efforts. The Stasi studied these precedents carefully, determined to prevent similar humiliation. Each attempted tunnel in the 1960s and 70s was met with elaborate countermeasures, from ground sensors to double agents planted within escape groups. Some betrayals are especially haunting. In one case, an engineer trusted by his friends to design a tunnel turned out to be reporting every detail to the Stasi. He guided his companions into the underground passage, allowed them to believe freedom was within reach, and then led them straight into the hands of waiting guards. The files show the precision of the trap, the cold language used to describe the capture, the absence of any recognition of the human cost. For the Stasi, the success of the operation was measured in statistics, in reports delivered upward, not in the shattered lives of those who had dared to resist. Air and water routes were also monitored. Rivers along the border were patrolled, bridges reinforced. Those who tried to swim across faced not only guards but treacherous currents. In one recorded case, a young man attempted to cross the Spree River in central Berlin, only to be shot in the water within sight of tourists on the western side. His death provoked outrage abroad, yet inside East Berlin, the official report spoke only of the neutralization of an escape attempt. This cold vocabulary was part of the state's effort to dehumanize dissent, to reduce desperate acts to sterile incidents. As the years passed, the Stasi's confidence grew. It believed it could anticipate resistance, infiltrate it, crush it before it became dangerous. By the 1970s and 80s, large escape operations had dwindled, partly because of improved defenses, partly because of the pervasive fear instilled by the Stasi's successes. Yet the ministry never relaxed. It trained constantly, developing scenarios of sabotage, espionage, and mass defection. The wall itself became a laboratory of control, a place where techniques were tested and refined. The operations were not only defensive. The Stasi also sought to project power outward, to recruit spies abroad, to infiltrate organizations in West Germany and beyond. While the war symbolized division, the ministry used it as a base for offensive intelligence work. Double agents passed information about NATO strategies, about West German politics, about technological research. Some of these operations lasted years, even decades, sustained by careful handling and the promise of ideological reward. The West was never free from the gaze of East German intelligence, just as the East was never free from the Stasi's hand. Through it all, the files grew thicker. Every operation generated reports, photographs, transcripts. Successes were celebrated in secret commendations, failures buried under layers of classification. To read these records today is to glimpse a world where human courage and human betrayal were interwoven daily, where hope drove people to dig through earth with bare hands, and fear drove others to betray those closest to them. The wall stood for 28 years, and throughout that time, the Stasi fought not only against physical escape, but against the very idea of freedom. Its operations were calculated to send a message. Resistance was futile, betrayal was inevitable, the state always won. And yet, the persistence of attempts, the ingenuity of ordinary citizens, the occasional triumph of successful escapes, all testified to the resilience of the human desire to live without chains. This was the paradox of the wall. It was meant to be impenetrable, yet it was constantly challenged. It was guarded by an empire of surveillance, yet it could not fully contain the imagination of those determined to cross. The Stasi's counter-operations may have been relentless, but they were also evidence of the very weakness the regime sought to hide, the knowledge that its people longed to be free, and that no amount of control could erase that longing. The Stasi was not simply a secret police force. It was also a broker of human lives. Behind the facade of ideological purity, the East German state discovered that dissent could be monetized. Political prisoners, men and women jailed for attempting escape or for minor acts of resistance, became commodities in a system of covert trade with the Federal Republic of Germany. From 1963 onwards, West Germany paid for the release of thousands of such prisoners, sending hard currency, goods, and credits in exchange for human freedom. The practice was known as Häftlingsfreikauf, the ransom purchase of prisoners. The files record the numbers with bureaucratic clarity. More than 33,000 political prisoners were released in this way between the 1960s and 1980s. Each transaction was shrouded in secrecy. Negotiators met quietly, agreements disguised as humanitarian gestures, but in reality, it was an economic strategy, a way for the German Democratic Republic to acquire the hard currency it desperately needed. The socialist state was short on Western money, essential for buying technology, food, and goods that its planned economy could not supply. Prisoners became the currency. For the families of those imprisoned, the trade was a salvation. Husbands, wives, sons and daughters were suddenly released, allowed to cross into West Germany. Yet for those who remained in the East, the practice underscored a cruel reality. The state had placed a price on dissent. It could imprison you, sell your freedom, and profit from your suffering. The moral contradiction was stark, yet it suited both governments. West Germany could claim it was rescuing its compatriots, while East Germany quietly bolstered its economy without admitting weakness. Beyond prisoner trade, the Stasi was deeply enmeshed in the broader propaganda machine of the regime. Every arrest, every trial, every controlled release was also a performance. Newspapers trumpeted the vigilance of the state, the protection of socialism, the dangers of Western subversion. Trials were staged to send messages, often closed to the public, yet widely whispered about. The message was consistent. The state is strong, betrayal is punished, loyalty is rewarded. This propaganda extended to education. Textbooks presented the wall as an anti-fascist protection barrier, a defensive measure against Western aggression. Children were taught that their country was under siege from imperialist enemies and that vigilance was necessary for survival. The Stasi provided material to schools, ensuring that its vision of the world penetrated every classroom. Fear became not just personal, but institutional, embedded in the very language of instruction. Economically, the wall and the Stasi were drains on the state's resources, maintaining 90,000 officers, hundreds of thousands of informants, and the infrastructure of surveillance required enormous investment. Yet it was justified as essential, a cost of survival. The paradox of East Germany was that it claimed to represent the working class, while devoting much of its budget to repressing that same class. Files from the 1970s reveal constant anxiety about the economy, about shortages, about the need to secure Western technology. Spying itself became an economic activity. Agents targeted West German companies, seeking to steal industrial secrets, blueprints, and research that could be funneled back to the East. In some cases, the theft was successful. East German industry advanced in certain areas thanks to espionage. In others, the attempts failed, exposed by counterintelligence. But the effort illustrates the depth of the regime's dependency. Even as it preached socialist superiority, it relied on Western goods and knowledge, acquired legally or illegally, to sustain itself. The Stasi was not only guarding the wall, it was also feeding the state's hunger for survival. The politics of control also required alliances. The Stasi maintained close ties with the Soviet Union's KGB, sharing intelligence, learning methods, and coordinating operations. Soviet advisors were embedded in East Berlin, while East German officers trained in Moscow. The exchange was two-way. The Stasi developed expertise in certain areas, particularly in infiltrating West Germany, and provided valuable information back to the Soviets. This relationship was another layer of control, ensuring that the East German state remained firmly tied to the broader bloc of socialist security services. Propaganda and diplomacy intertwined. Official speeches portrayed East Germany as a bulwark of peace, while secretly the state relied on repression and covert trade. Internationally, the regime sought recognition and legitimacy, yet at home, it depended on secrecy and fear. The contradiction was obvious to many citizens, but to speak it aloud was dangerous. The Stasi ensured that doubts remained private, that conversations ended before they became dangerous, that the silence of the people continued. For nearly 3 decades, this system endured, balancing ideology with pragmatism, repression with economic necessity. The prisoner trade provided money, the propaganda machine provided justification, the surveillance apparatus provided control, and yet, beneath the surface, the contradictions grew sharper. Each prisoner sold was evidence of repression. Each stolen technology was evidence of weakness. Each file created was evidence of a population that could not be trusted. The wall stood strong in concrete, but the foundations of the state were slowly hollowing out. The economy of control was, in truth, an economy of fear. It was built on the value of silence, on the calculation that repression could be profitable, on the illusion that people could be managed indefinitely. But as the 1980s advanced, the cracks widened, shortages grew worse, dissent found new forms, and even the most powerful surveillance system could not prevent change from coming. The empire of the Stasi, for all its reach, could not stop the forces that would soon bring the wall crashing down. By the late 1980s, the German Democratic Republic stood brittle beneath its heavy armor. The Stasi remained powerful, its files thicker than ever, its officers still numbering in the tens of thousands, yet the society it sought to control was changing. Economic stagnation deepened, shortages grew intolerable, citizens queued for basic goods, while broadcasts from the West poured over the airwaves, showing a world of abundance just beyond the wall. The contradictions were no longer hidden. Dissent began to emerge in churches, one of the few spaces where groups could gather with limited interference. In Leipzig, Dresden, and Berlin, small prayer meetings became rallies for peace and reform. The Stasi monitored them carefully, infiltrating, documenting, photographing, yet the gatherings grew. By 1989, tens of thousands were marching weekly in Leipzig, chanting for freedom, for democracy, for the right to travel. The chant, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people," rang out in streets once silenced by fear. The regime hesitated. To crush these demonstrations violently might have bought time, but it risked international outrage and uncontrollable escalation. Memories of Tiananmen Square in China that same year weighed heavily. The Stasi prepared plans for mass arrests, for decisive action, yet the political leadership faltered. Erich Honecker, the longtime head of state, was forced aside in October. His replacement, Egon Krenz, promised reform, but the promises rang hollow. The tide had shifted. Inside Stasi headquarters, the files kept arriving. Reports noted the chants, the banners, the speeches. Officers recorded growing participation, the presence of families, the peaceful nature of the protests. The very system designed to suffocate dissent was now serving as a witness to its spread. Mielke himself, aging and out of touch, declared in a speech to Parliament that he loved all people, words that provoked laughter, not loyalty. The fear that had once made silence universal was dissolving in the collective courage of the crowds. The decisive moment came on the night of November 9th, 1989. That evening, an East German spokesman, Günther Schabowski, held a press conference in Berlin to announce new travel regulations. The plan had been to introduce limited opportunities for citizens to apply for exit permits, but Schabowski, flustered and poorly briefed, told reporters that the regulations were effective immediately. When asked when the new rules would begin, he glanced at his papers and replied, "As far as I know, right away." The news spread with lightning speed. West German broadcasters carried the statement, and East Germans watching illegal broadcasts heard the words repeated. Crowds began to gather at the border crossings, especially at Bornholmer Strasse in Berlin. Thousands demanded passage. Border guards, trained for years to shoot, faced a choice for which they had no clear orders. Their commanders were unreachable. The chain of command, paralyzed by confusion, the Stasi officers embedded at the crossings could only report the growing crisis. Shortly before midnight, overwhelmed by the pressure of the crowd, the commander at Bornholmer Strasse gave the order to open the barrier. For the first time in 28 years, East Berliners poured through without checks, without visas, without fear of being shot. They were greeted by cheering West Berliners, embraced by strangers, carried on shoulders, celebrated as if a war had ended. On that night, the wall ceased to function. The Stasi, which had built its empire on control, surveillance, and fear, could do nothing. Its files contained the names of those who marched. Its offices were filled with reports of dissent. Its officers still stood at posts. Yet the spell had broken. The people no longer feared them. And without fear, the apparatus collapsed. Within days, citizens stormed Stasi buildings, demanding access to their records. Officers tried to destroy documents, shredding, burning, discarding, but the scale was too great. Trucks carried fragments to dumps, yet still millions of pages survived. The archive of repression could not be erased. The fall of the wall was both sudden and inevitable. Sudden in its timing, sparked by a slip of the tongue at a press conference, and the courage of crowds. Inevitable in its cause, built from years of contradiction, from the hollow promises of socialism that delivered shortages and silence instead of prosperity and freedom. The Stasi's mastery of surveillance had delayed collapse, but it had also revealed the regime's fragility. No state that must watch every word of its citizens can ever truly claim strength. For those who lived through that night, the memories remain vivid. The sound of concrete being chipped away by jubilant hands, the taste of champagne shared with strangers atop the wall, the tears of families reunited after decades, the flood of East Berliners streaming into Kurfürstendamm, marveling at shops filled with goods they had only heard about. It was the triumph of human will over repression, a moment when history turned in favor of the people. For the Stasi, it was the beginning of the end. Within weeks, its authority evaporated. Officers resigned. Headquarters were occupied. Archives were seized. Erich Mielke, the man who once sought to know everything, was placed on trial. His power gone. The empire of files and fear had crumbled in the face of something it could not contain, the collective voice of the people demanding change. The wall had fallen, and with it, the surveillance empire that had defined East Germany for nearly 3 decades. Yet the legacy of that empire would remain, written in millions of pages of files, in the memories of betrayal, in the scars of a society taught to distrust itself. The fall was liberation, but it was also revelation. The people of East Germany would now confront the truth of how deeply they had been watched, and by whom. When the wall opened, joy poured through Berlin. But what followed was not only celebration, it was a confrontation with truth. Citizens who had lived for decades under suspicion finally gained the chance to see what had been recorded about them. In the months that followed, crowds stormed Stasi offices across East Germany, determined to protect the files from destruction. In some places, shredders still hummed. In others, bonfires of paper burned in courtyards. But the weight of the archive was too vast to erase. Miles upon miles of files were seized, preserved, and eventually catalogued. The state that had thrived on secrecy now found its secrets exposed. Inside those files were the voices of millions, detailed reports of conversations, notes about friendships, suspicions about jokes, sketches of family trees, photographs of private meetings. For many East Germans, reading their file was an experience of shock. The names of informants were revealed, sometimes strangers, sometimes acquaintances, sometimes those closest to them. Husbands discovered wives had been coerced into reporting. Children learned that parents had been under surveillance. Friendships dissolved in anger, in grief, in disbelief. The betrayal was intimate, and it cut deeper than prison walls ever could. The German parliament created the Stasi Records Agency in 1991 to manage access to the archive. Citizens could request their files to know what had been written about them, who had reported, and how the state had seen their lives. Millions applied. For some, the knowledge brought closure, an explanation for years of unexplained misfortune. For others, it reopened wounds, showing the cold language with which the Stasi reduced human relationships to coded entries. The archive became not only a record but a mirror, reflecting the fractures of a society forced to police itself. The Stasi Museum in Berlin, housed in the former headquarters at Lichtenberg, preserves this history. Visitors walk the same corridors where officers once typed reports, enter the office of Erich Mielke, preserved as it was when he fled. The furniture is ordinary, drab, bureaucratic, but its very ordinariness is chilling. It shows that repression was not always dramatic or violent. It was administrative, methodical, carried out in offices that looked like any civil service department, yet with consequences that destroyed lives. The lessons of the Stasi extend beyond Germany. The sheer scale of its surveillance, the thoroughness of its files, the way it turned ordinary citizens into agents of control. These serve as warnings to every society that values freedom. When surveillance becomes total, when trust is eroded, when every word might be recorded, the fabric of human life begins to unravel. The Stasi perfected this system, but it also revealed its limits. For all its files, it could not stop people from desiring freedom. For all its informants, it could not prevent the crowds from gathering in Leipzig. For all its walls, it could not prevent the wall from falling. Yet, the damage lingered, families fractured, communities scarred. Many former informants struggled with shame. Some insisted they had been forced. Others admitted they had sought favor. The reckoning was uneven, painful, never complete. Historians still debate how deeply the system penetrated and what long-term effects it left on German society. Some argue it bred a culture of mistrust that echoes even today, a hesitance to speak openly, a tendency to guard words. Others point to the resilience of reunified Germany, the way East and West have built a shared democracy despite the scars. Both truths coexist, as complex as the history itself. The files remain open. Citizens, researchers, journalists continue to study them, each page a glimpse into the mechanics of repression. They are not relics to be locked away, but lessons to be examined. In the quiet reading rooms of the archive, individuals still discover what was written about them decades earlier. Some cry, some laugh bitterly, some sit in silence. The paper holds not only the past, but also the reminder of what can happen when a state seeks to know everything. Memory takes many forms. In Berlin, fragments of the wall still stand, covered with graffiti, symbols of division and of resistance. In schools, students learn about the wall not only as concrete, but as a system of control. In museums, exhibits show hidden microphones, intercepted letters, surveillance cameras disguised as everyday objects. Each artifact carries a weight, a reminder that ordinary tools were once weapons in a war against privacy. The story of the Stasi is not only about East Germany, it is about the universal temptation of power to know, to control, to catalog. It is about how fear can be institutionalized, how trust can be dismantled, how freedom can be stolen not only by prisons, but by silence. And it is about how, despite all of this, people still resist, still dream, still find ways to reclaim their voice. The collapse of the wall gave East Germans their freedom, but it also left them with the burden of memory. They must remember not only the joy of liberation, but the cost of surveillance. They must live with the knowledge that for decades their lives were observed, dissected, recorded, and the world must remember too, for history has shown that walls can rise quickly, that surveillance can grow quietly, that fear can be cultivated, almost unnoticed, until it becomes normal. The Stasi's empire of files stands today as evidence not of strength, but of fragility, not of loyalty, but of coercion, not of triumph, but of fear. It is a history that belongs to Germany, but its lesson belongs to everyone. In the end, the story of the Stasi and the wall is not simply about one country or one era. It is about the human condition under surveillance, the quiet battle between control and freedom. For 28 years, East Germany lived within concrete borders and invisible chains, a society where the state sought to know every whisper, every thought, every secret, and yet, for all its power, the surveillance empire could not extinguish the most fragile and most resilient of human desires, the desire to live without fear. The wall fell, not because the Stasi failed to gather information, but because information alone cannot hold a society together, a state that mistrusts its people, that reduces every friendship to a report, that turns love into suspicion and hope into betrayal, builds its foundations on sand. When the tide of change came in 1989, the wall crumbled because it had never been strong enough to withstand the truth that people, when united, can no longer be ruled by fear. The archives remain, shelves upon shelves of paper, a monument to both the ambition and the futility of total surveillance. They remind us that freedom is fragile, that silence can be manufactured, that trust can be weaponized, but they also remind us that walls can fall, that empires of fear can collapse, and that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to endure. Wherever you are listening tonight, and whatever time it is where you are, remember this: power can build walls, but it cannot silence the longing for freedom.